With Ezekiel Elliott and Melvin Gordon holding out, we'll tell you whether their replacements are worth playing in DFS. We'll also tell you which stacks you should be playing, and we'll tell you which chalk plays to stick with and which ones to avoid. This is the Football Guys Daily Fantasy Power Grid, brought to you by DraftKings. I'm Austin Lee, and I'm joined, just like last year, by John Lee, Devin Knotts, and Ryan Hester. During the next hour, we're going to get you ready for the Week 1 main slates on DraftKings and FanDuel. John Lee is our resident scientist. We're going to kick it over to him first to talk about Vegas. He does our Vegas value chart article over at footballguys.com. He's going to tell us kind of what the Vegas landscape is for Week 1.
Vegas value chart is live on the site for those of you who are subscribing right now. And you'll note the first thing, the top two games, top two totals on the board this week are off of the main slate. So we won't talk about those in this game. The number one team in terms of total points this week, Kansas City Chiefs, going to Jacksonville, playing a defense that we'll talk about in a bit. I think it's a little bit overrated, and I think Vegas agrees with us. Total team points there is about 28. Next up is Philadelphia playing at home against a terrible Washington team. We'll talk a little bit about where you might want to exploit some angles there. And then below that, you have a road favorites. We don't see that a whole lot. And the LA Rams going to Carolina and a potential shootout with a game total of 50 points. And then from there, we have quite a few large home favorites this week, which I think we're going to get to about where you're going to put your money with regards to cash games this week. I get a lot of comfort around some big home favorites at running back. Those teams include Dallas, Seattle, the Chargers even. You might even make an argument for Devin's Cleveland Browns. And so I think that's a good way to segue into what's going next. So hand it back to you.
Fade the Browns this year.
So Devin held up the red black-eyed Joe sign. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our show format, whenever someone disagrees, they hold up a red black-eyed Joe like this, and when they agree, they hold up a yellow black-eyed Joe to show support for that pick or description. So let's move on to quarterbacks. But before we do, be sure to check out footballguys.com. All of our Week 1 DFS content is free for insiders. All you have to do is sign up for a free insider account, and you get all of the content for free, including our new lineup optimizer. Check that out. Let's talk about quarterbacks. Devin, so we're not playing a Cleveland quarterback this week. Who are we playing?
Yeah, I'm fading the Browns until they prove it because they have so many unknowns heading into this year, and the hype is off the train. I mean, it's off the rails. It's people want to be ahead on the bandwagon for the Browns. I think they're a 8-8 team. I really don't see them being much more than that. But two quarterbacks that I'm going to throw out there. So Carson Wentz, I think he's my dark horse for the MVP this year. I think he has a ton of weapons that they're going to be using him. He has J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. He has Deshaun Jackson. He has Zach Ertz. Throw Dallas Goedert in the mix. There's a ton of weapons for Wentz this year going up against a Washington secondary that they weren't horrible last year, but they weren't great either. So I think that he's my favorite quarterback of this week. And then at a cheaper end guy, we mentioned that the potential shootout in Nick Foles. Nick Foles going to Jacksonville, going against a Kansas City secondary that was one of the worst, if not the worst, in football last year. And they're projected to score 24 points. So if you try to figure out how they're going to score 24, could it be Leonard Fournette? Sure, but do we trust Leonard Fournette after his last two seasons? I personally don't. And we'll get into wide receivers in a minute, but there's a number of wide receivers that Foles has too that it may not be a clean stack, but I think one of these Jaguars receivers will have a big game with Foles. I mean, he's the most competent, and I know I'm a Blake Bortles guy, but he's the most competent quarterback they've had there in a long time. So I'm high on Foles this year. I'm high on the Jacksonville offense. I think that it's an opportunity that he's still way too cheap.
It wouldn't be the Power Grid without Ryan referencing UCF in some way. I'm glad it happened early in the show.
But what were the odds that someone else said, I'm a Blake Bortles guy? I mean, what were the odds anyone would say that ever?
Right. That's the one time all season on the Power Grid.
I had
Ryan,
to.
Who are you playing at quarterback?
Well, Devin mentioned a few of them. One that I really like is Lamar Jackson, too. We obviously have a built-in floor frankly, and a ceiling with how well he runs. Plenty of reports coming out of Baltimore all preseason long about how dynamic that offense is going to be. The only slight concern this week is how dynamic will they need to be. They're playing at Miami. The game total there is super duper low. So I don't know that it's a high upside play, but I do think you can pencil him in for, kind of a 2.5 to 3x value, but certainly don't expect a 5 or a 6 kind of thing.
One thing real quick on that. So
sure.
I think I like Jackson a lot. I think that the one thing I'll disagree with you on is that his upside isn't there. So Miami has one of, if not the worst linebacking core in the nation, in the NFL. They traded Kiko Alonso. Raekwon McMillan has been horrible. And down the stretch last year, Josh Allen had 95 yards and 2 touchdowns rushing and 135 yards rushing. So I think there's a big rushing opportunity where Lamar Jackson's ceiling, I mean, he could rush for 100 yards this week.
Sure.
And I think his pricing is a little bit more favorable over on FanDuel if you're thinking of which site to play him on. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, that's a good point. And certainly the 100-yard potential is there for him any week, right? So I guess the only thing there is if Baltimore kind of packs it in for all or part of the fourth quarter would be the only hesitation. But you're right. Anytime a quarterback has that kind of rushing upside, there is a ceiling, of course. The other one I'm kind of thinking of, and it's not a cash game play at all, but I don't know. You guys tell me if it's a little cute. Is actually Kirk Cousins hosting Atlanta. The last time we saw him, I think was the third preseason game. I think he was like 3 for 19. So just kind of a stench coming off of him a little bit. But it is a game that should be high scoring, should be back and forth. It's stackable because we know who Kirk Cousins is throwing to. It's generally just 2 players. So that's another one that I'm kind of looking at in a game that could be a shootout going both ways.
The problem is, what format are you going to play him in? Is he safe enough for cash, and does he have the upside for GPPs? I don't know.
Yes. The first question, I'd say I'm not feeling super safe, but I do think there's some upside there.
It sounded like John said he'd play him in both. Tell me, John.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, I play him in both. He's the guy I've got written down as one of my 3 cash game quarterbacks as of recording time, which is Monday evening. Look, they're slated to score 25.5 points this week. They're going against Atlanta. Last year had one of the worst secondaries in the league. I think they were 29th DVOA last year, secondary-wise. And he's 5,500. He's probably $800 to $1,000 too cheap on DraftKings. He's one of the guys at quarterback. We were talking earlier. I think Brian mentioned it 2.5 to 3 times. At quarterback, really what you want to try to get is 4x value. It's one of the positions where it's a lot more consistent, and so you should be trying to get more value from your quarterback position than other positions. So he's a guy that I think is in play for both of those, GPP and cash. The only drawback is if you roster an Adam Thielen stack, it very well could be Stephon Diggs who blows up. So that is the caveat with regards to GPPs.
And John, you said you had a couple other guys on your cash game list. Give us another one of those.
Before I do, can I ask? I want to go back to Devin's comments on Foles and Wentz. I know you're a cash game guy. Do you think those guys are cash game viable? Because I'm not so sure I would agree, but I would like to hear where you meant to play those guys.
So Foles on FanDuel at 6,500 is too cheap. I think he's in play. And I think at 5,300 on DraftKings, if you have to go down there, and we'll get into running backs in a minute, you don't really have to go that low, but I think you could. I think that if you wanted to play a Barkley or if you wanted to play a top-end running back, I think that Foles is definitely in play. Wentz on DraftKings at 5,700 isn't horrible. He's not playable. He's not a cash game guy on FanDuel at 76. But I think, like I said, I'm extremely high on Wentz this year. I think he comes out and looks like he did 2 years ago before the injury. So if we get that version of Carson Wentz, then yes, at 5,700 he's fine. If they ease him back in, then that's a problem, obviously. Okay.
Well, it's important because I think cash game and GPPs are obviously very different in terms of roster construction. And I'm going to poo-poo on both of your picks in terms of cash games, and then I'm going to give you my cash game picks so that you can poo-poo them.
And you're going to say Jameis Winston, and I'm going to say
No, I'm not. Lamar Jackson, I have some real fear in playing him in cash in his opening game because they're a touchdown favorite, and I think that somebody said it. I don't know whether it was Devin or whether it was Ryan, but I think it was Devin talking about how poor the linebacking core is, and you can run, and you referenced Buffalo's quarterback from last year. The issue is it might not be Lamar Jackson running. It could very well be Mark Ingram running and taking all those points. I think we all can agree that Lamar Jackson running 16 to 20 times a game is less than optimal, and they're going to try to build a team this year where he's sitting in the pocket more often than running. So take that for what it's worth.
Especially in games where he doesn't have to run, right? They can win. They're going to want to save him. They have playoff aspirations. They're going to want to save him. If they're up 14-0 in the first quarter,
right.
Not running.
They're playing one of the worst teams in football with the Dolphins and potentially the Redskins being the other team that I'm thinking of. They may not have to do a whole lot. So it gives me a little bit of fear. All right. So Kirk Cousins is one of the three guys that I'm looking at for cash games this week. Two of the others, Kyler Murray in Arizona going against Detroit for some of the same reasons that we just talked about with Lamar Jackson. I think he's going to run that game. It has a fairly high game total at 48 points. It looks like it should be back and forth. And I think he's a guy that can easily get you 3 to 3.5x with his legs. And he's got some weapons around him that will enable some decent points for his $5,600 salary. And then lastly, and this is where I'm a little afraid to say it because I think you're going to jump on me for it, but I'm a big fan of punting quarterback position. If you can get a guy who's got 30 touches in him, and Jacoby Brissett he's 4,400 this week. All that he needs to return value here is about 12 to 15 fantasy points, and they're going to be playing.
You talked about earlier.
They're going to be playing in a negative game script, and they're going to go up against a defense that's lacking its best player. Well, maybe its second best player in Derwin James. So I think he's a guy that if you need the salary cap, and I don't think that you need it this week, but if you do, if you want to go heavy, you want that Julio Jones, you want Le'Veon Bell and Travis Kelce, he's a guy that I think you can build or you can slot in. I won't say you'll build around him, but that's those are my three guys for cash this week.
So isn't the answer, especially on DraftKings, just to play Patrick Mahomes?
I think you can.
I think you can. Let's not even worry about it. I think that he's what were they? The highest scoring team this week?
They are the highest scoring team this week. The irony is, in Steve Buzzard's initial ownership projections for the week, Mahomes is only 6% owned, which is somewhere in the middle of the pack. I'm actually very surprised by that. And I'll cut to the chase here. He's my number one GPP quarterback if that stays the same, because I'll take Patrick Mahomes at 6% all year long. I don't care what defense he's playing against.
I mean, we're going to get into running backs in a minute, and to me, there's two clear values that can afford you Patrick Mahomes. Mm-hmm. So I just want to touch on Kyler Murray real quick. Coming into the preseason, I was as high as just about anybody on him. What worries me in the preseason, and maybe it's just the preseason, totally get that, teams are putting a spy on him, and he wasn't outrunning the spy. So does that limit his upside as far as if he didn't run a 40-yard dash at the combine, so we don't really know how fast he actually is. If he's not as fast as what we think he is, there's a real problem there that teams are going to force him to throw in order to set up the run. That they may put a spy on him all game one. That's the one caveat I have against him in cash, is that his running upside may not be what we actually think it is.
It seems like the three of you have some different ideas of what your cash game plays are this week, but maybe I can get the three of you to agree on one thing, because there's a guy you haven't mentioned. And I want to see the red or yellow black-eyed Joes on this, is Jameis Winston a cash game play this week? I see two reds. Ryan's got me a red.
Devin doesn't have a yellow, so.
Devin doesn't have a yellow. He's kind of wishy-washy. Okay, so which is interesting because I think he's going to be a very popular cash game play. So it sounds like at the very least there's mostly agreement that you shouldn't go with that popular play this week. Any other thoughts on quarterbacks before we move on to running backs? Awesome. Okay. So if you've stuck with us this long, please use the YouTube comments to tell us which of these quarterback picks you like and dislike. We've given you a lot of food for thought. Tell us which ones you like and which ones you don't. let's talk about running backs. John, I'm going to come to you first. We've got two high-profile running backs holding out in Melvin Gordon and Ezekiel Elliott. So we need to cover whether or not to play, the guys that are filling in for them. And then obviously sort of not really recent news, but, Jerick McKinnon is not going to be playing. So I don't know if that opens the door for like a Tevin Coleman play. So, John, give me your take on this.
Yeah, I think running back is a position this week that's a little more clear than the other positions that we'll be talking about throughout the show. So, you know, on DraftKings, and I think that multiple sites now you have the flex position where you can plug somebody into that flex position. I think for cash games, it should be a running back. You have to figure out where you're comfortable there. But for me, I have about 7 cash game running backs right now, as opposed to 6 wide receivers. That sounds even, but when you start taking in positional scarcity, you can then deduce that running back is a lot more, flush than what it typically is. This week, to your question, if Ezekiel Elliott doesn't sign, and I think that he will sign, I just don't know that it'll be active. I think Tony Pollard is just a lock and load play at 4,500 as a big home favorite. They're touchdown favorites at home against the Giants, who are not going to be very good this year, behind an amazing offensive line. I think we're all aware of this. He's a guy that you just plug into your cash games, and you're going to have to be extremely high on him in GPPs as well, I would imagine. So that goes without saying. My other guys in cash this week, not very popular in Steve Buzzard's original ownership projections this week, but I like Chris Carson at home as well. They're a 9-point home favorite against the Cincinnati Bengals, and he's only $5,700 on DraftKings this week. So I think that he's in a great spot. If you're reading what's coming out of camp, Pete Carroll's talking a lot about getting him the ball in the passing game, and he's got some great hands is what we're hearing, and Rashad Penny hasn't done a whole lot, despite what we thought maybe coming into the beginning of last season. So a lot of reasons to like Chris Carson this week, and I love him for GPPs if he stays at ownership levels that we're talking about right now on Monday. But I suspect as more information comes out this week, we'll see him in double digits. And then, I'll just say in general, I think the Minnesota Vikings are too cheap this week against Atlanta's defense. Across the board, we already talked about Kirk Cousins. We're going to talk about Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs, but Dalvin Cook is super cheap as well. He's only $6,000 on DraftKings. I think he's way too cheap, and he definitely gets some consideration for cash games. I'll stop there and give the guys a chance to talk about some of the ones on their list.
Hey, Ryan, who else you got on your list?
So another guy you can talk about here, there's quite a few, but right in that same price range as Cook, just a little north of that is Nick Chubb. So obviously all this pricing, particularly DraftKings, was released. Devin's fading the Browns.
You didn't hear what I said.
Devin's fading all Browns. No.
You got to pay attention, Brian.
Their offensive line is a disaster. But go ahead.
They're favored. He's their only running back. So anyways,
bet the Titans.
I do think that if pricing were released prior to week 1 instead of months ago, that his price would be higher. I mean, his price came out, I believe, guys, tell me if I'm wrong, but prior to the Duke Johnson trade, right? So news has certainly boosted his outlook, but not his price. I also like looking at the top, and to me, I'm not quite a Saquon Barkley fan in general. I just hate rostering players on horrible teams, even though he does touch the ball constantly. But one below that, I do like Christian McCaffrey. So I think he's just, in terms of raw points, he's at the top for me. And one last one I wanted to talk about, John alluded to it earlier, in the Baltimore-Miami game. I know it's a road running back. We don't like that as much. We'd rather a home favorite. But Baltimore's going to win that game, and I think comfortably. So I think you'll see Mark Ingram get a lot of run in that game too, and he's only $5,100 on DraftKings, so that's a pretty fair price.
All right, Devin, you held up your red black eye Joe for any Browns. Who do you like?
I think Austin Eckler needs to be talked in cash game viability. And we'll get into receivers. I love Keenan Allen this week too, but you have to ask yourself, how are the Chargers going to move the ball? And we saw with Gordon out last year that Eckler has a big passing game presence on that team. And with no Tyrell Williams this year, there's less options. Hunter Henry's back, I get that, but Eckler is a guy who could catch 6, 7, 8 balls, which is at 5,500 on DraftKings is pretty good. Cook is my favorite guy, so I'll agree with that there. And then 2 more that I like. So Le'Veon Bell, I think, is in a really good spot this year. Buffalo allowed the 6th most points to fantasy running backs last year. I think that they're going to want to come out and feature Bell, feature their signing. He's going to want to have a big game coming off of sitting last year. And I think that he's going to be kind of under thought of. I know that Steve Buzzard has him pretty high on DraftKings right now, but I think that his numbers will come in slightly lower than that, just because I think that people will think that they're going to ease him in. So I think he's a cash game guy for me. I think that he could catch 5, 6 balls and go for 100 yards rushing. And then Kerryon Johnson. So we've been hearing about how they're going to feature him more and more in the passing game and running game. And Arizona is the team to feature, basically do whatever you want. So they had the worst rushing defense last year. And Cliff Kingsbury is never a defensive guru. So his teams in college always gave up some of the most points in college football. So, and in the preseason, they haven't looked good either. So I'm looking at Kerryon Johnson, Dalvin Cook, Eckler, and Pollard as my top guys, in Le'Veon Bell more as a GPP play. Are we doing anything with Darius Geis with the news that came out today that the team is going to be featuring him quite a bit?
If you're not playing the Browns, I don't know how the hell you're going to argue to play the Redskins.
Yeah. Well, it's just a matter of ownership, right? So if people stay off of him because of the injury, I mean,
I've got a Redskin for you later in the show. He's a 3K crapper, and I'll give that to you later in the show.
I mean, Steve has him at less than 1%.
This guy will be less than 1% as well.
At less than 1% owned, I'll take a couple shares of Darius Geis. He's talented enough that he can break a long run if he gets the red zone looks.
But do we believe that with Adrian Peterson there? You know that both of them, they're going to split some at some level. I know what came out. Yeah, I'm getting there. But I know what came out today with Darius Geis. He's going to he's going to be, the offense is going to run through him. So says Gruden. But on third down, they're going to go to Chris Thompson, just like Ryan was trying to say, but I talked over him. And so if he gets 2-1 or even 3-1, how many touches does he get in a game where the game script doesn't support his usage either? It's a Chris Thompson game. If you're going to take any running back in this game, Chris Thompson, for the same reasons that you described with Kerryon Johnson, could get 8 touches or 8 catches here. I meant Austin Eckler, not Kerryon.
At 4,400, I think he's cheap. He's cheap enough. What about Frank Gore? Any love for Frank Gore?
Come on. What?
With them cutting LaShawn McCoy.
Why wouldn't we start the Dolphins running backs too, just to complete the trifecta of the 3 worst offenses in the entire?
People are going to look at Frank Gore. I mean, people are going to look at it. Remember, I gave you Frank Gore last year in 110 yards against the Bears. He's going to get enough carries that at 3,900 on DraftKings, if he falls in the end zone, he's worth it. It's at less than 1% owned. He's a guy that people are going to ask themselves, with them cutting McCoy, should we play him?
For $100 more, you can have Peyton Barber.
I'd rather have Frank Gore than Peyton Barber.
I'd rather have neither. Real quick, back to guys that people might actually want to play.
Sure.
With Kerryon Johnson, I'm a little worried. It is week 1. I think wait and see should be a theme that at least that I'm kind of looking at all week. But I'm kind of concerned that maybe he's not the goal line guy. I mean, last year LeGarrette Blount was, even after Johnson took over. This year they have C.J. Anderson, who, if nothing else, is built somewhat similarly to LeGarrette Blount in that he's large and can fall forward into the end zone. So Matt Patricia is just a weird coach and a horrible one for fantasy football. So I just want to see Johnson's usage first before I start plugging him in as a lock in a cash game.
That seems like a fair concern. If you're playing Johnson, I think he's a little bit more favorably priced on DraftKings than on FanDuel. And if you're playing against Devin's advice, playing Nick Chubb, I think he's a little bit more favorably priced on FanDuel. Any concerns there, Devin? You recommended Le'Veon Bell. Any concerns about him not playing last season and maybe rusty at all? No, you just like he's going to go right into this.
Yeah, no concerns.
Okay, all right, just double checking there. All right, guys. Any other running backs we want to mention before moving on?
Can we just go around the horn real quick on who we're playing for cash?
Sure. Yeah. Hit me.
There are a lot of names out there. So for me, it's Cook, Eckler, and Pollard on DraftKings.
Yeah. What do you think, John?
I got Pollard, Cook, Chris Carson, and I do have Carry on, but I didn't mention him.
Gotcha. And Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, Pollard, Cook, and McCaffrey. Although I do like Carson as well.
Seems like we got a lot more agreement here than we did on quarterbacks. John, you flashed up some signs which said, come back to me.
Well, I want you to come back to me because I think this position, as I led with, is more plush than wide receiver and even tight end. And so I think we should spend a little more time on it.
Sure.
Because I think when we get to wide receiver, my guess is we're going to be, talking about the same core of people. And I think here there's a lot more room for discussion, particularly around GPP. So a couple things I wanted to talk about. To Devin's point with Austin Eckler, we actually didn't mention any GPP quarterbacks to the best of my recollection. I think I mentioned maybe Mahomes. But I think Phillip Rivers is definitely in play as a GPP quarterback for some of the reasons that Devin already referenced. Eckler, if he catches 8 passes and the offense goes through the air, it makes a lot of sense there. You got Mike Williams, you got Hunter Henry, who I think's but is in store for a breakout season. Keenan Allen, if he can stay healthy. There's a lot of reasons to think that this game could go through the air for the Chargers. And so for that reason, Eckler is definitely in play. I'm not so sure about cash, but definitely in GPP. And I think Phillip Rivers is the kind of the cog that holds that whole thing together. So don't sleep on him. Now I'm going to go to running backs like I promised. You guys are going to hate this one, but I like it. Jordan Howard at 4,200 against Washington. I think he's the guy they're going to use in the red zone this year, and I think he could very easily score 2 touchdowns in this game. He's 4,200. They're 10-point home favorites. He gets those goal line carries. All he needs to do is score once and get 50 yards, and we're talking about close to 4x on his salary for DraftKings. And then the other one, I'm not going to tout this. I'm actually going to bring it up for discussion. One of the things that this third time I mentioned Steve Buzzard's name tonight, but one of the things he's really told us as a staff is to take good players when they're owned at low-digit percentages. Todd Gurley is currently projected at 3% at 7,900. He's $1,000 cheaper than those top-end guys. Where are we landing on Todd Gurley this week in GPPs? Oh, it's a tough question.
It's a tough question. I'm not doing it just because I don't build enough lineups that I need to do it. If I only build 5 to 10 GPP lineups, you guys know this. He's not going to be in my selection. I don't hate him, but he's not going to make the cut for me. If I'm going to spend up, I'm going to go to McCaffrey, carry on Dalvin Cook, and save a little bit. I'm going to miss that range of Gurley.
What do you think, Ryan?
I like the line of thinking, though, because I'm looking at Steve's numbers now, and Gurley is in the same roster percentage as Dontrell Hilliard and Kenyon Drake. One name, like if you really read these 5 or 10 here, one name really sticks out.
If you can find receivers that you like, and we'll get into it in a minute, at the lower end, I'm fine with it. It's just hard to do.
Yep. Well, it is, but and when we get into receivers, I have 1 or 2 that I'm looking at, and then also in stacks. I think this game, we haven't even talked about this game, but it has a 50-point over/under. At least that's where it opened, right? So, this game could end up having shootout potential too.
And we've mentioned Steve Buzzard's roster percentages several times. He's one of our guys on staff. He does these great ownership projections. They're built into the DFS lineup optimizer, as well as sort of like pages where you can just look at what his projected ownership is for the week. And he won a ton of giant contests last year. He kind of knows what he's doing. What was it, John? He won the FanDuel Million and another big one, right?
And the WFSC, the FanDuel Championship. He brought in the duo of FanDuel contests last year. In 2 contests, 1.5 million. I'd say that's a pretty impressive showing.
It's a solid showing, and his ownership projections are a lot of what he sort of credits his understanding of GPPs to. So go check those out.
He's also doing an article this year, which is basically inside the mind of Steve Buzzard, which probably is worth the price of the subscription by itself. So it's definitely something that you guys should go and check out. It'll be posted, I think, Fridays. Just basically his thought of the overall slate.
Yeah,
and
it's free this week.
At the risk of making Steve's head even bigger when he listens to this episode, I'll also make a plug. He is starting a new show, one that will be done in conjunction with Roto Grinders. Roto Grinders' Chris Jimino, who does their ownership projections, he and Steve will get together every Tuesday night and just spitball for about 30 minutes about ownership projections, injury situations, and how they see everything panning out. So that should be available to the general public, as well as obviously our subscribers, as early as Wednesday every week. So keep your eye out for that.
Nice. Please hit subscribe and hit that little bell on our YouTube channel. We'll tell you more great nuggets of things. You can find all that information over at footballguys.com. Let's talk about wide receivers. Ryan, I'll throw it to you first on wide receivers. It sounds like Amari Cooper is going to play this week. There was a little bit of iffiness at one point. And then obviously it's been old news that AJ Green's been out for a while, which maybe clears some space for a guy like Tyler Boyd to be a play this week. Ryan, who do you like this week at wide receiver?
Yeah, so I've alluded to it here throughout the show, but there are some high-priced running backs I like. And, to John's point, I think you need to go 3 running backs, and in order to do so, you got to find some value at receiver. So it's a little tough, but Adam Thielen is one we've talked about, so I'm going to let the other guys break it down a little further, but I think he's on everyone's list. But getting down into kind of the cheap range, or at least the moderately priced range, I like 2 Tylers in the same game, both Tyler Lockett for the home team Seattle there, and Tyler Boyd for the visiting Bengals. Who you mentioned there in the top, Austin. Last year, Boyd, got a significant target bump without AJ Green, for obvious reasons, and did pretty well with that. So I think there's some volume to be had there. I don't think Seattle is nearly as good as they've been in years past, obviously. So there's some targets and some volume, some cheap volume for Boyd. Another one I like here, and I think the other guys might have something to say about the Jacksonville duo of receivers, but I think D.D. Westbrook is going to be the guy that leads that receiving core in targets. And again, for 4,800 on DraftKings in that potential shootout that we talked about here at Kansas City, I'm looking at him too, just from kind of a cheap volume guy to get in to where I can pay up at other positions. And then the last one I'll mention, and this I don't, again, because I'm more of a wait and see week 1 guy, but kind of a preseason all-star here in terms of training camp news blurbs was Curtis Samuel of Carolina, who's down at 4,200. And much like for our season-long folks, there was a large chasm between DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel in terms of their draft position, and there kind of is in their pricing too, and I'm not really sure there should be. I think there's going to be some volume. And again, I'm just going to take the cheaper side.
I just don't trust that offense. I don't trust anything about it.
Outside of CMC.
Outside of McCaffrey. I don't trust Cam's shoulder. I don't trust his leg or foot injury. I
don't trust.
Well,
no, I mean, I get the concern, but again, that's not necessarily a cash game play, but
yep.
That game's got to get to 50 points somehow if you want to believe Vegas, or you just take the under, I guess.
I mean, this is it's week 1, and I feel like it's easier to lean on those Vegas lines like week 4, 5, 6, a little further into the season. So maybe some of these lines aren't going to play out the way you think they should, and maybe you should trust that instinct a little bit more in week 1 than maybe going against Vegas in like week 7, let's say.
Yeah, I'm more of a guy who just doesn't want to speculate on player improvement, which is why I'm staying away from D.D. Westbrook and staying away from Curtis Samuel. And maybe it's because of the cash game mindset, but it's more of I want trusted guys in my lineup who I think have a defined role rather than a bunch of us are telling you that he's going to have a role. With that said, Marquise Lee is my favorite guy in Jacksonville. He's the safer of the 3 receivers there. I know DJ Chark is getting some love. I can't do it with Chark. I don't see that at all. He's still a very raw receiver that, yes, he's talented, but until he defines a role, I can't align to that. Tyler Lockett is my favorite receiver on the board. My second favorite receiver is Sterling Shepard, just entirely based on how are the Giants going to move the ball outside of Barkley? They lost Beckham. Golden Tate is suspended. They have to throw to somebody, right? I mean, he's in line for 10, 11, 12 targets, something like that. And at 5,000 on DraftKings and 6,000 on FanDuel, I think he's in a tremendous spot. And then the other guy I really like this week is Keenan Allen. So going back to that, there's a few safe guys on this slate. And Keenan Allen, John talked about Rivers. How are they going to move the ball? It's likely through the air without Melvin Gordon. Go to your playmaker, and they allowed 90 yards or more 7 times last year. So it's a Colts secondary that can be exposed quite a bit. And then who do you guys like as a Rams receiver? We talked about them being a high scoring team. For me, it's Brandon Cooks, but I could see the argument of Robert Woods or maybe Cooper Kupp. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm kind of with you on Cooks there. Again, with Kupp and rehabbing from that injury, all the news is good, but again, on the theme of wait and see, that's pretty tough. Those guys are always hard to figure out. I think Cooks is probably just the best player out of the 3. So good call there.
Devin, how do you feel about Chris Godwin this week? Everyone was kind of meh on Jameis Winston, so maybe that ties into being kind of not interested in Godwin either. What do you think about him?
I like him. I think that he's in line. He's going to be a GPP play for me. If I'm playing cash, I'll go with Mike Evans, just because he has more of a target share. Godwin's the big play guy, and he's another guy that we're projecting to break out. So in cash, I'm not going there. I want safe guys that I can predict, and it may come back to bite me. But in week 1, I don't want to play the game of assuming players are going to step up for huge roles in cash games.
John, who else do you have a receiver that you'd like to mention?
It's pretty thin, Austin. I looking at my list, the guys have talked about. At the top of my list, I think I was going to lead the same way that Ryan did, talking about 2 Tylers in the same game. I think Tyler Lockett is my safest cash game of the play of the week. He's the guy I like most. DK Metcalf is injured. Moore is hurt. There's just not a whole lot to like about that receiving core outside of Tyler Lockett, who actually finished last year really strong as well. So he's a guy I like. Maybe. So I'm leaning against. We're talking about Jacksonville. I'm leaning against this, but I do have them. In terms of our projections, they are cash game viable, but DJ Shark and
Baby Shark.
Yes, and DD Westbrook. There was a part of me that really debated this, and it's still Monday, so maybe I'll change my mind. But there's an argument to be made, and I don't know if it's a strong argument. I think I'm arguing against it, but I'm going to play devil's advocate and say that those 2 guys, you could roster them both in cash for $8,100 and pick up, what are we going to talk about? 16 targets between the 2 of them, given the game script? Is that fair to say they would get 16 targets? Would you trade 16 targets from Nick Foles for $8,100 is the question. And I think I'm leaning towards no, but I'm throwing it out there as, if it was an $8,100 receiver with 16 targets, you just sign up without even looking. The issue is it's Nick Foles throwing those targets, and it's those 2 guys catching those targets, which I think takes 16 down to, 10 or 12 or something.
And it's 2 roster spots instead of 1.
Yeah, it limits your overall upside, and I get the thinking, but
yeah.
As I said, right?
I was throwing it out there, that's all.
Yeah.
In terms of GPPs, I'll throw out a couple names. I think Tyreek Hill is definitely in play. He's only, I think he's 10% on Buzzard's projections as of today, and I think a lot of that's probably based on shadow coverage expected from Jalen Ramsey. But last year,
Watkins.
Say again.
Give me Sammy Watkins.
I'd take Sammy Watkins too. I think he's firmly in play. He's going to be under-owned because if you're going to have the balls to go with the Chiefs receiving game, you're probably going to go with Tyreek Hill because he's the bigger name, or Kelce because he's an even bigger name. And Sammy Watkins actually had a very serviceable 2018 if you go back and look at the numbers in terms of efficiency. And he's a lot cheaper than those other guys. So no issues with that. But Jalen Ramsey does not scare me against Tyreek Hill's speed. Mike Evans, we talked about this just a little bit ago when you asked a question about Chris Godwin. Mike Evans, 7,900. He's currently 8% on our projections. He's going to have a combination of Akella Witherspoon and Quan Williams. When he lines up out of the slot, he's going to – this is insane at the NFL level. He's going to have an 8-inch height advantage over Quan Williams when they line up out of the slot. And if you're Tampa Bay's head coach, I can picture him. He's David Dodds. What the hell is his name?
Bruce Arians.
Arians, sorry. If you're Bruce Arians, how are you not lining him up out of the slot in the red zone to take advantage of that big, massive height advantage? He's a guy that could very well score a pair of touchdowns in this game. And again, it does. This is a game that you could stack as well because it's got a game total of 50 points, if I'm not mistaken. And then I had two more guys I wanted to mention. One is Damian Harris, 3K crapper. Don't get more than 5% exposure to him. Cincinnati Bengals, last chance you wide receiver, came out of nowhere. There's
Damian
not a whole.
Harris.
Yes.
Isn't that the New England running back?
It may be. Now you got me question myself. We're in preseason mode. It is Damian and Damien. Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. Damian Harris, Cincinnati Bengals. He's earned the starting wide receiver position opposite Tyler Boyd. And if you're the Seattle Seahawks, who are you going to focus on?
Damian Willis.
It's Damian Willis, but I was going to let him finish.
Oh, I wrote it down incorrectly. Well,
That's all right.
This season,
We're rolling on the power grid. We just make it happen.
This season's starting off just the way last season ended. Damian Willis. I wrote it down incorrectly, but everything I said was actually correct except for his last name. But the game script actually sets up very, very well for him. They should be trailing the majority of this game. If the Seahawks are going to focus on anybody in the wide receiving core, it's likely going to be Boyd, potentially those wide receivers because they're a little more established, and he's $3,000. So if you need that salary savings, he's going to be 1% owned. I say get 4 to 6% if you're playing MME, and I think that's more than enough to get an advantage on the field. And then the other guy, Trey Quinn, running out of the slot in Washington. Case Keenum loves himself a slot wide receiver. Go back. He's played – this is his fourth team in 4 years. 2016, played for the Rams. Tavon Austin had a really nice year that year. 2017, played for the Vikings. Adam Thielen had himself a really nice year that year. Last year, Manny Sanders in Denver was having himself a heck of a year before he got himself injured. And now we go in a game where they're going to be trailing by a touchdown. At least that's what Vegas is telling us. And Trey Quinn is the guy running out of the slot in Washington. Nobody's going to be talking about it. This is why you watch the Power Grid. I think he's a prime GPP candidate for $3,000 on DraftKings where you get full PPR.
I've got a couple of big names we have not mentioned. Let's do a quick round of Black-Eyed Joes before we move on to tight ends. Is anyone looking at Odell Beckham for GPPs? I know Devin isn't, but it looks like John says yes and Ryan says no. And then how about Amari Cooper? With Ezekiel Elliott out, are they going to throw a little bit more? Is Cooper's upside worth buying into here? John says no. Sure. And Devin says sure, and Ryan says sure. Okay. Just wanted to mention a couple other guys. I know those are kind of higher priced guys, but wanted to toss them in.
Did we not mention Julio Jones at all?
Oh, we almost made it through without Ryan mentioning Julio Jones.
I mean, Devin hates Julio Jones, but he averaged 100 yards a game last year. So worth mentioning on any given week, especially one where it could be high scoring, as I mentioned earlier. The target distribution there is always pretty predictable in Atlanta. So I'm not doing it because I'd rather pay up at running back this week.
I prefer Ridley. Doesn't get Xavier Rhodes. I mean, Julio's going to get shadowed by Xavier Rhodes, and I know Xavier Rhodes didn't have a great year last year, but I anticipate him to bounce back a little bit.
It's worth mentioning because I feel like we might have gotten some comments about why didn't you guys talk about one of the best receivers in the whole league. So
yeah,
we've done it, and it might be GPP only, but as I look at Steve's thing,
he's always in play, right? For a GPP, if you're doing even 20 lineups, I want to share a Julio, but I'm not going to go overweight on the field.
Well, and John mentioned, you want good players in bad spots, but Julio is 6th on Steve's list, so it's not as though there's too much sleep on him. So we've mentioned Julio.
Nice. It wouldn't be the power grid if Ryan didn't bring up Julio and Devin didn't disagree with the play.
Thielen or Diggs?
Thielen.
It's a toss-up. I'm not going to sit here and tell you there's one over the other. It's a toss-up.
All right. I'll go Diggs just because Thielen missed some of the preseason and Diggs played most of it.
Yeah.
And John refuses to break the tie.
Flip a coin.
If I had to break the tie, it would be based on ownership, and I think Diggs is lower owned, so I'd take him.
Game theory. Got it. Tight ends, fellas. Oh, what's up?
One last thing, and since we were on the 3K crapper thing, and John mentioned the slot corner for San Francisco, the third receiver for Tampa is also really tall, and I'm not mentioning him just because of where he went to school, but Rashad Perriman is going to earn some time this week. And if you are into the Bruce Arians doesn't use his tight end narrative, Perriman will be on the field against a really short guy. So season-long folks who are in really deep leagues, keep that in mind too. I think he's going to get some time.
Nice. At tight end, we're keeping an eye on Jordan Reed, perhaps. He's in the concussion protocol. That's not good for a guy who's had a lot of concussions, so I imagine we'll see a lot of Vernon Davis in this game, although it's not a great matchup. And that's the only note I really had on tight end. John, why don't you kick us off on the tight ends?
I am building my cash games around Travis Kelce this week. 7,100. He feels like, this is something you won't hear from me more than say 3 or 4 times. But I'm spending up at tight end this week. It's a highly variable position, but if anything is going to happen, Travis Kelce is going to get almost 3x on his value. There's not a whole lot of high value receivers or running backs this week that I love. He's a guy that I like at 7,100. I think it's overflow when looks from Jalen and Tyreek Hill aren't there. I think Kelce becomes the guy at 7,100. If you want to go lower, and I have no problem with either of these 2 receivers for what it's worth, but I just have the extra salary to spend in my initial builds. But if you want to go lower, 2 guys I'm looking at in cash, Evan Ingram against Dallas at 4,800. Last year, he tore them up for 761 and a touchdown and 581 in the touchdown the 2 times that they played. And then the cheapest you're going to get Hunter Henry all year is this week at 3,900. And I think that he's certainly in play if you need to save salary. But I'm starting with Travis Kelce in cash.
And Hunter Henry has that favorable salary at DraftKings. Not quite as favorably priced at FanDuel, but still a decent play. Devin, you disagreed with the Travis Kelce call. Tell me more.
No, it's just I disagree with him in cash. I think Hunter Henry is the clear guy, just based entirely off of the savings. We talked about, we threw out some random names at wide receiver there, guys. It tells us how little we like the low end of receivers. I'm spending up at receiver, going with Hunter Henry down in the low end to save at tight end. Like John said, it'll be the cheapest that he's at all year. And I mentioned Keenan Allen, but we think the game is going to go through the air. And Hunter Henry at 3,900 he's the same price as Albert Wilson. He's going to have 5 or 6 catches, 50, 60 yards, potentially a touchdown. That's good enough for me. I understand that Kelce could break my lineups, and I'm okay with going against that.
Ryan, what do you think of these picks, and do you have any other guys that you have your eye on?
Only as a kind of a Hunter Henry pivot, although I'm looking there. Well, I guess they're rostered about 7% difference, but kind of for the same price, maybe the exact same price. Mark Andrews in Baltimore. Just a hyper athletic guy who was making red zone plays all preseason long. They're going to use 2 tight ends a lot in Baltimore, but he will certainly be one of them, and he will likely be the guy when they only have 1 tight end. He's clearly the best pass catcher, perhaps on the team, but certainly among the tight end group. Quick, easy reads for an inexperienced passer, seam routes, athlete, super tall, touchdown potential.
John, what do you think of Zach Ertz this week? I think he's going to be a popular play.
He will certainly be popular. It depends on what his ownership is going to be. Let me look. I see 7%. At 7%, I think that's pretty fair. I would be as high as 10%, but I'm not going extremely overweight because I feel stronger about other players at the position, and he does cost you a premium. I suspect he'll end up being double that by the time the polls close on Sunday afternoon.
The polls, the DFS voting polls.
Yeah.
Devin, any other tight ends you want to mention?
Delaney Walker at 3,500 is intriguing.
Who's throwing to him?
That's a good question. Cleveland allowed the 7th most points to tight ends last year. At 30, like I said, at 3,500, I don't love it. I mean, I'm pretty much going to be 100% between Henry and Kelce. Maybe one share of OJ Howard in there just because of the big play potential. And Tampa Bay is going to throw the ball, which we mentioned, and they're going to have some passing success. So for the most part, I'm either going way up, or I think that Hunter Henry is such a good play that I'm pretty much just targeting him this week.
Yeah.
Guys, what about Greg Olsen, 3,200? The Rams have some really good cornerbacks. So you might argue that's Cam Newton doesn't have anywhere else to throw. I mean, Greg Olsen's been around forever. We tend to not like older players in DFS, but he is 3,200, and he's certainly got touchdown upside. Where do we land on him in GPPs?
I did miss practice today, so keep an eye on that. For me, he hasn't been relevant since 2016. I just can't get behind it.
What about a guy like Austin Hooper? Anybody got any interest in Hooper this week? 3,200? No.
I mean, if you want to take one shot at it's fine. There's just there's so many options in Atlanta that I don't know. It's hard to pick between Sanu and Ridley and Hooper who's going to have that big third game. So I wouldn't go overweight on the field, but if you want to take a shot on Hooper, I'm fine with it.
Yep.
I'll have some Austin, but not a tremendous amount. I think Steve's got him at 3%. I might go as high as 5 or 6, but it's just there's limited upside. He's not going to score 2 touchdowns, is he? Has he ever done that? I mean,
I'm sure he has, but you're right. It doesn't happen that often.
Right.
Doesn't Greg Olsen have to score 2 touchdowns to be worth it? I mean,
I think he can.
We made the you made the comment about old players, and I kind of agree with it, but I also don't love picking guys who just add no value to their targets. I mean, these are catch and fall players we're talking about right now. You know, in Greg Olsen, in Austin Hooper, it's just not even Zach Ertz to a certain extent, but he does have 2 touchdown upside in any given week. These guys just don't add anything to their targets. I just, I want to take guys who could run after the catch and make plays. And speaking of, does anyone have any thoughts about George Kittle?
Oh yeah, he's on the list.
Okay,
but he's like. You can't just keep doing this, right? Like Julio Jones and George Kittle.
Nobody mentioned them. There's going to be people that care.
Well, I mean, right? Those guys. It's like
I think it's worth a discussion. I think that I'm off playing him
because obviously he's on your list.
He's the best. He's the best the best receiver. Excuse me, that was Freudian slip. But he's the best receiver on San Francisco this year. And they're in a game that could potentially shoot out, but it just seemed too obvious to talk about. But sure, yes, George Kittle should be at the top of your GPP list.
Format. People want to know.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
All right, let's talk defenses. If you've made it this far, please thumbs up our video. Thank you. Defenses, any concerns about playing Baltimore as your defense on the road? Usually we're like, oh, they're on the road. You got to be cautious. It seems like this week you throw that out the window because it's Miami. Devin, do you like the Baltimore defense or do you have a different one?
I think in cash, I mean, they're probably the top defense, but they're 3,800, and can you afford it? So for me, and you guys just get your black eye Joes ready, but I'm going with Tampa Bay defense against Jimmy Garoppolo. Garoppolo looked absolutely horrible in the preseason. He was throwing it would seem like every day there were news reports of him throwing interceptions in practice. We saw him in game with a 0.0 quarterback rating. At 2,200 against San Francisco, I think that the Buccaneers defense might be my cash game play just to apply to some of the other other top end options.
Ryan, what do you think at defense?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of mentioning someone or some obvious, how about Seattle hosting Cincinnati? That's
I'll get behind that. That's all right.
That's too obvious.
Yeah.
And then how about also Philly, who I believe is hosting Washington, right? John has a couple times to just how terrible they are. So again, similar to Baltimore, though. I mean, they're 3,600, so they're up there. It might be tough to fit them in, but I mean, these are the ones where you should kind of be starting. And if you don't have the money, then go down from there.
John, who's your defense?
Yeah, so apologies to Ryan. It's past my bedtime. I get a little grumpy after 8:30. Yeah, the Ravens, Seahawks, and I have the Jets on a list that I think are viable here. I do have the Buccaneers as well. I don't think you need to do that, but if you really need to save salary because you're loading up on high dollar players, defense is always a position I'm willing to punt for cash games. So no issues with that this week. Going with the Buccaneers, not so much because I think Garoppolo is going to flop this year. I'm not sure I'm buying into the camp hype about how bad he's been. It's just 2,200. There's a lot that can go wrong, especially with a team that doesn't have a wide receiver that 90% of the population doesn't know.
Yeah. Let's move on to stacks. Guys, I want to hear a couple of stacks you've got. Maybe one that's a little chalky, maybe one that's not so popular. Devin, tell me about the stacks you're playing.
Yeah, so I'm going – my favorite one in GPPs this week, and I mentioned it before, but Patrick Mahomes and Sammy Watkins. I think Tyreek Hill gets locked up against Jalen Ramsey. I anticipate Ramsey will have a better year than he did last year. And Watkins is a good enough receiver that if in a mismatch, they can go to him. So he's a guy that I'm looking at. And then the other stack that I'll throw out there, if you really want to load up at running back, Eli Manning and Evan Ingram. I think Dallas will be behind, or Dallas will be ahead. The Giants will have to throw quite a bit. Eli Manning wasn't – if he normalizes the touchdowns, and touchdowns I understand are important, but if he threw 6 or 7 more touchdowns last year, he'd be on the same point per game basis as Baker Mayfield. So he wasn't that bad. I mean, he was bad. Consistency was bad. But when he was good, he threw for 300 yards a couple times last year. And at 5,000, you can load up with a lot of running backs, a lot of receivers. That's spending too much time talking about Eli Manning. So let's move on.
Well, I always cringe when Devin mentions Eli Manning.
I mentioned him like 6 times last year.
Yeah, exactly.
Eli or Jacoby Brissett, Devin?
In GPPs, Eli.
Because Brissett probably gets a decent amount of ownership.
They're projected within 1% of each other right now. I'm sure Steve.
Oh, if that's the case,
yeah.
If Brissett's 3.5%, I like Brissett and T.Y. Hilton too.
There you go.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a popular stack. I think it's going to be higher owned than what Steve's got on his sheet there.
But if Manning stays at 2%, why not?
John, what do you think about stacks?
Love the game stack with Jacksonville and Kansas City. I think you can do that a lot of different ways. My favorite to probably glean throughout the course of the show, Pat Mahomes, Travis Kelce, run it back with Leonard Fournette, because I think Fournette's going to catch a lot of balls this year. They've lost TJ Yeldon, and there's not a whole lot behind him. So assuming he can stay on the field and his hamstring doesn't give way, which is maybe a big assumption, that's a game stack I really like. Or you can run it back with one of those cheap receivers we've already talked about. Elsewhere, we kind of referenced this in the Julio Jones conversation. I think Matt Ryan and Calvin Ridley is a real stack that I'd like to go after. He comes at a discount, Calvin Ridley, that is, compared to Julio. I think he brings just as much upside. I know he killed my bankroll early in 2018 because he was hot as could be in the initial month of last year, and so we've seen that already. And he's going to come at a $3,000 discount and be owned at half the rosters as Julio. So he's a guy. And then lastly, I'll mention, I don't think anybody's brought this up, Matthew Stafford to Kenny Golladay. Patrick Peterson, it's been pretty quiet. He's on a 4 or 6 game suspension to start the season. And for the last, I don't know how many years it's been, he's been kind of the cog that makes that secondary role. And I wonder what they're going to be like without him. I think Galladay is a special talent, and I think they'll go to him often. And this game has shootout potential in the sense that, we keep hearing a lot of stuff about the air raid offense there in Arizona and blah, blah, blah. If this starts going back and forth, I think Galladay is the kind of talent that could end up with a pair of touchdowns. And Stafford's 1% right now, and Galladay's 7%. So there's one that I think is kind of off the radar.
Brian, who are your stacks?
Yeah, shout out to David Dodds for the cash plus stack here. Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. Moving down the list a little bit, we haven't mentioned Dak Prescott, and he's 1.1% according to Steve. If you're a conspiracy theory, narrative street truther, you may think that maybe Dallas wants these other guys to do really well. So there's a case to be made for Tony Pollard, who we talked about, but also, hey, let's pass the ball around and move the ball that way and show Zeke we can do it without him a little bit. So Dak Prescott to Amari Cooper. And you can even run it back if you really think that game could have some scoring, because both, I think Devin mentioned Evan Ingram, also Sterling Shepard earlier. So both of those guys are going to be some cheap targets too. So that game actually has a little more intrigue than I thought it would. I alluded to Cam Newton earlier. So Cam Newton, Curtis Samuel for Carolina, if you think that game's going to get up there. And that was all I had that hasn't been mentioned yet. So thanks.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see a little bit of stacking in cash games. We've mentioned these guys a little bit. You might see a Winston Godwin stack in cash games. If you might also see even a Cousins Thielen stack in cash games. Those are going to be some popular plays, I feel like.
Russell Wilson, Tyler Lockett, just because Cincinnati's secondary is horrible.
Sure. Yep.
And we haven't mentioned Wilson all show. So if I was going to do it, it'd be in a GPP, because Wilson's volatility isn't always where it needs to be. It's especially for cash. But so for me, he's always a GPP guy. But if Lockett's going to have a big day, then Wilson's probably having a big day as well.
That's a good mention. All right, fellas, parting thoughts. This is where you get to mention a player you forgot to mention, or give some words of wisdom that are specific to week one, Devin, or mention a feature that you think people should check out over at footballguys.com. Devin, what are your parting thoughts?
So 2 quick things. So I'm taking a stand and playing Josh Allen every single week in one GPP lineup. I don't want to play the game of trying to predict when he's going to be good. So I'm just playing him every single week, because it's all based on rushing and scrambling and broken plays and that type of thing. So I'm playing him every week in 1 or 2 lineups just because. And then I guess I'll throw out there our college content. So if you haven't played college football and you're sitting around on a Saturday, we have plenty of college football content that's actually included in our subscription price. And I probably spend 30 hours a week on projections. And then Dan Hendry and Ryan, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, Zamicelli. Do our DraftKings and FanDuel write-ups. They do a great job with that. So if you've never played before, you can reach out to me on Twitter, or reach out to me a variety of different ways. But we'll help you through it, and we'll guide you through it, and we'll answer any questions that you might have. So just throwing a plug out there.
Yeah, and it's free this week. All of our DFS content, both college and NFL, is free for week one over at footballguys.com. Ryan, parting thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll plug an article here. One of the guys on staff who I really we're kind of like-minded folks here is Phil Alexander. So Phil writes an article called GPP Domination. So looking for edges in DraftKings tournaments is the official description, and that is what it delivers. So that's a good one to check out, especially this week while it's free. Get a taste, and then subscribe and get it for the rest of the year. A little strategy point here is this, typical GPP, getting under budget is a way to naturally make your lineup a little different than folks. But this is a great week to do that too, because of the roster or the pricing, being released early. There are guys who should be priced higher anyway, so you're sort of almost building in a lower end roster if you just take these value players. And, lastly, a little more serious note, thoughts and prayers to the Bahamas. They're getting destroyed by hurricane right now. And hopefully everybody cross their fingers that my house in Orlando here doesn't get impacted in the next couple of days either.
Yep. Definitely our thoughts go out to the folks out there. John, final parting thoughts for week 1.
Yeah, trust what you know about talent. Don't buy into preseason hype and camp hype too much. Established talent will always win out. But above and beyond that, just there have been a lot of things happening. If you're just plugging into fantasy football, specifically DFS for the first time since last year, there have been some changes in the industry, and I think it's worth pointing out that there are a few sites running rake-free contest at this point. Fantasy Draft has a subscription-based, subscription fee now that makes rake about 3%, which is about 20% of what you would pay at DraftKings and FanDuel. And I'll still be playing at both of those sites, but for you low-level players who are only putting in so much every week, that's a place you have to consider. Yahoo is also running what they call no management fee contest. And so, rake is a big deal, and you need to be building it into your process to understand, to be profitable. You want to win more than your opponent, and you want to pay less rake. And so those things come into play. Be sure to check those things out.
Yeah, and if you're newer to DFS, we've got a whole section at the bottom of our week 1 DFS landing page that's sort of an archives of things that talk about bankroll management, kind of more general concepts like rake and things like that John mentioned. So be aware of what your bankroll process is for week 1. Don't blow it all right here in the first week.
Or do, and just wait a couple weeks until you
That's another angle. I don't think most people would recommend that, but
double up your bankroll week 1. Let's go.
Devin's all in. He's excited for football. So be sure to check out our new lineup optimizer. It's free this week. Let us know what you think of that. Comment in the YouTube comments. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like our video. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next Friday morning with our week 2 episode. On behalf of John Lee, Devin Knotts, and Ryan Hester, I'm Austin Lee saying thank you for watching and thanks for being a football guy. To check out our content at footballguys.com, click the button on Devin's face. To subscribe to our YouTube channel, be sure to click on the button on John's face. And if you'd like to see our latest video, click on the giant video in front of Ryan's face. Click any of those now. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.